Hello, everyone. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, depending on your time zones. I think we wait for 1 more minute for everyone to join, and then we start with our session. Okay, it's already 32. So I start with our session. Dear participants, dear panelists, welcome to this talk, The Invisible Women in Drug Economies and Gender-Sensitive Drug Policies. I see our attendance adding up. I start introducing myself. My name is Adela Latia, and I'll be the moderator of this session. And I'm here to represent the Global Partnership on Drug Policies and Development, which is a German-funded, government-funded program implemented by GIZ and focused on development and human rights-oriented drug policies. Before I start this session, I'd like to give some logistical notes. Please note that the participants cannot turn on their cameras or their microphones. Any questions you have or comments, please put them in the Q&A session on the bottom of your Zoom screen. And we will try to answer your questions either through the chat or in the panel. Without further ado, I'll continue with our panel. Many of you might ask why we started this session and why the invisible women. Some of you might have heard that the German government has adopted a feminist foreign and development policy, which makes gender equality very high to the agenda of German government and also its partner institutions and organizations. This panel is organized under the framework of Drugs and Development Hub, which is a joint initiative of Global Partnership on Drug Policies and Development, the program I work for, and the GI-TOC, which is the organizer of the conference. And the aim of this Drugs and Development Hub is to raise awareness and linkage between drugs, organized crimes, and development. But why invisible women? So some of you might ask, what is this invisible women and why we are talking about them? But on the other side, you might have run into this book of Carolina Perez with the same name, Invisible Women. And invisible women are in many areas of life. We know that women are almost 50% of the population, but still they are not studied as much, or women-related activities are not studied as much. And this is in many areas. Like in agriculture, women are majority of labor force, but on the other side, only 14% of land ownership is in the name of women. On the other side, all tools are not done for the size of women's body. That makes them have more labor-intensive work, for example. The same happens in areas like health, economy, mobility, etc., where we know women are there, but they are not studied. And we happen to know that the same is happening also in illicit economies. This is why we are having this session, to understand why what women are having as a role in the illicit economies and how we can better benefit and make policies that fit the needs of women and men properly. Together with our panelists, we would like to open or to challenge the discussion of the invisible women in drug economies, how we can better design gender-sensitive drug policies, and how can academia, international organizations, national governments work together to make more gender-sensitive drug policies. And this is why I'll ask the question of the invisible women to all of our panelists, and I'll start with Jennifer. So Jennifer, what does it mean in your research work the invisible women. Jennifer, please, I also kindly ask you to shortly introduce yourself.
Hi.
Thank you.
So I'm an academic researcher. And that means I spend most of my time at home without speaking to anyone. So apologies for the frog in my throat. I am based in a sociology department, but I would say my work is firmly within criminology. And as an academic researcher, I have done a few different projects around women involved in the drug trade. So let me briefly outline those. So my PhD was a project on drug mules, specifically looking at women's involvement in the international cocaine trade. And I spent about a year and a half speaking to people involved in the drug trade in prisons in Ecuador. So I spoke to men and women, but I was especially interested in gender and in women. Following that was turned into a book. Shortly after that, I did a very short project on women involved in street level crack and heroin markets in the UK. And most recently, I've done, along with Lindsay Laban, a literature review, as wide-ranging as we could manage, although these projects are always imperfect, but trying to look at women's involvement in production, trafficking, and sales. And in that project, I think where we landed up was how and when women come to market, when is it that gender comes to matter in the international cocaine trade? Okay, so what does this theme of invisibility mean in my work? So I feel old sometimes when I do these kinds of things, because I first started thinking about women in the drug trade in, honestly, about 2001. As an undergraduate student, I was really inspired by feminist work. I remember reading stuff in feminist philosophy and feeling really inspired about, the importance of adding in women's perspectives and concerns and how that could transform what we thought we knew in our understanding. And as an undergraduate sociologist, I was very interested in gender arrangements in social life, and I thought they were fascinating. And I came upon this possibility of doing work in Ecuador. So I think there's a kind of an overarching task always of trying to find out what are women's experiences, how does gender shape their experience, as a matter for social science in general, for understanding what's going on. And I want to talk about the ways that invisibility has played out in a kind of a general sense, thinking across these different projects. And I think the first thing really is women's invisibility in data has been a persistent problem. So the United Nations World Drug Report, very important, is based on a couple of different kinds of recording mechanisms, but really they record drug seizures. That's what they record. They record what, where, when. They maybe sometimes include information on who's present, but very rarely. And gender is not routinely collected as part of that data. So I kind of got interested in this around 2009, but 2011, there were moves in United Nations, UNODC, to think about gender. So I was interested in where does the data come from? And I went and looked back at this recently, and gender is still not recorded. So when it comes to quantitative data and a global picture, forget about it. It's not routinely recorded, it's highly partial, and I don't think it is very useful at telling us actually what women are doing. It tells us that women are present, but that doesn't tell us anything else than that. And I go back to Rosa Del Olmo's work. In 1986, she was writing about women's involvement in the drug trade from Venezuela. And she noted that women were often arrested because they were at home during the day when the police arrived, which for me is a really stark reminder of what any kind of quantitative data actually records. It records women being present, but that's about it. So we can really infer from that. And then in qualitative data, there are also persistent inequalities. So there's something that happens, which is that women are not interviewed because they're considered marginal. I remember reading studies, I can't remember who it was. There was a study, it was in the US, and it was a prison-based sample, but they didn't speak to women because they thought that they were only involved in a marginal or peripheral way, and therefore wouldn't have knowledge that would be useful in understanding the international drug trade, right? They're only girls, they don't know what's going on, was what I read, and it made me absolutely furious at the time. But then there's another thing, which is that women are included but their perspectives are not included as people with gendered experiences. And this happened in the UK. There was a Home Office study on middle markets. This must have been about 2005. It was the Matrix study. Forgive me for not remembering what it was exactly, but women were interviewed. It was noted that they were involved as low-level players, or at least that's what women said when a researcher asked them. And then their knowledge and experience didn't feed into the kind of analysis. So there's a kind of a conceptual thing I want to speak to next. But most recently, I've been reading around women in online drug markets, and I noticed this strange phenomenon, which is the methods section tells you that they interviewed women, but then they don't get quoted and they don't get cited in the study. You know, you see the citations of where they present qualitative data. And I was really struck by this, right? Imagine in a sample interviewing men and women, but you only quote the men. There's something like deeply wrong about that. So at the conceptual level, I think often I'm struck by the ways that organised crime scholarship can kind of zoom out. There are questions asked about price or modus operandi or political economy. And actually that kind of framework makes it very difficult to see humans, far less gender. So there's something about the kind of concepts and questions that are asked. And sometimes that's to do with the kind of data that's available, right? If you're working from phone tap data or surveillance data, sometimes gender can be hard to infer from that kind of thing, being kind. So often women are ignored because where scholarship looks for like formalized criminal organizations, it loses sight of the context of these kind of informal places where women are always present. I'm trying to read my notes here. What do they say? I've got terrible handwriting. So women are kind of missing often from these kinds of paradigms, but I think often we ignore markets because they don't look like drug markets, right? When we go in with the perception of a drug market as something that's hierarchical, organized, financially motivated, that's what we're going to find. And we were beginning a project looking at women in online drug markets. And one of my colleagues said, hey, I've got an interesting online drug market. Wow, tell me more. She said, you'll never guess. It's this online drug market that's completely dominated by women. People who run it are women, the clients are women, and it's transnational. I was like, how have I never heard of this before? And what it was an organization based in the Netherlands providing medications for women who wanted to terminate a pregnancy at home. And those medications were sent internationally in an extremely grey legal area, in some places definitely illegal. And women often paid for that service. So they were asked to donate what they could to make sure that this was something that kept going. So this is an online international drug market, but it is something that completely falls outside of the purview of any scholarship on online drug markets, which are fascinated by, dark markets and Tor and hard drugs and weapons and organized crime. And that's what they go looking for. And it means that these other aspects of online markets are missed. And I think there's a real importance of this, right? Because I think if we have these kinds of drug markets in mind, it profoundly challenges us on what it is that we think we're studying. So if you go looking for an organization that's hierarchical and violent, that's all you're going to find. But what if drug markets don't look hierarchical? What if they don't look violent? What actually if they provide a services for people that can be things that support health and well-being? So I think thinking in terms of invisibilities, it's not just about adding women and stirring the pot and kind of equaling the score. For me, it's also about opening ourselves to have our kind of our frameworks and our ideas and preconceptions challenged. And I think that probably takes me to the end of my time. So I'll pass on to the next person, but I hope that sort of opens up things for discussion in a general way. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. That was also inspiring, and also seeing that there is research, but we need more to deepen and look more into real topics.
I can say something more on like why we need qualitative research and what in particular, but maybe that's something we can return to later. Okay.
You can go on if you want now.
Okay, in that case. So obviously we need qualitative work. But I think qualitative work helps us get over that problem of like presence versus participation and finding what actually do women do, and good qualitative work can really open up women, talk about their involvement in drug trafficking. I think often women don't have a huge amount to gain by admitting to being more organized or more further up the chain than they are. So very briefly, when I was doing research on international drug trafficking in prisons in Ecuador, women all told me that they were only drug mules. They didn't really know anything. But with time and getting to know people, they would admit actually they had had more complex histories and involvements with the drug trade than they'd previously admitted to. So I think giving women space to talk about these experiences is important in a kind of a judgmental and supportive way. And that takes time and it takes resources. Right. But I think there are particular invisibilities in qualitative work, which is generally, if we think about the drug trade as something that spans production, transportation, and sales, that is a journey that generally, production is generally in the global south and sales is generally in the global north. Most researchers are in the global north. So actually our understanding of street level markets is fairly comprehensive, dare I say it. I think it's dominated by the United States of America in cities like St. Louis, Missouri. There's loads of research from there. But when it comes to places that are not the USA, we know much, much less about women's involvement in street markets and in other places. So I think we need to pay attention to places that are not America. To be brutally honest, I think that's really important, but also especially in the global south, where there are formations of drug markets that are radically different to those that we see in the global north. The other thing that we have asked about a lot is why women are involved in the drug business. And we've asked much less what they actually do. And I think that reflects a kind of a gendered assumption that actually women don't do anything, that they're only there because somebody's forced them into it, that their involvement is passive and the result of coercion. Whereas assuming that they might actually be able to make some choices on what they do and they might have some agency in that involvement, for me, I think is really, really important. So more on the global south and more on what women actually do and not why they do it, because the why question, I think, is not that complicated, but what they do and where gender comes to matter in what women do in the drug trade, I think is phenomenally interesting and really vital for thinking about other things. Okay, now I'm definitely out of time, so now I'm going to stop talking.
Thank you, Jennifer. Super interesting talk. I'm sure we'll come back to that at the end of this session or before we close. But now I would like to go to another researcher whose work has been also an input for UN policy documents. So Cecilia, can you please also bring your perspective of the invisible women and how that's translated into the UN toolkits? And also please introduce yourself to the audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Adela, and thank you to the Drugs and Development Hub for this invitation. It's always a pleasure to share the panel with brilliant women, and in particular, Jennifer, whose work has been instrumental to inform my own. So thank you for that. I am a political scientist by training, so I come to this from a different perspective than Jennifer, and I also focus on international relations. And so I would consider myself one of those new scholars that has tried to understand violence in Mexico as it has increased in the last 15 years. And my focus has been particularly in the business models of criminal groups. So several of my colleagues, for instance, focus on the relationship of criminal groups with the state in Mexico. And that, of course, is very important and essential work. But I have pivoted from that. And what I try to focus on is how exactly these different criminal groups operate in Mexico, because that tells us interesting things about their behaviors. When do they choose violence? How do they recruit people? How do they choose to launder money? And so in focusing in criminal groups in themselves, I've, of course, have worked in relation to how women participate in these criminal groups. And so one of the things that I have really tried to do, and particularly in the context of Mexico, is really move away from the stereotype that women are only part of criminal groups because they have a romantic relationship or they're in or their family is well known to be in crime. And I think this is very obvious, for instance, in the case of Emma Coronel, who is married to Joaquin Guzman Loera, better known as El Chapo. And if you look at the press coverage of Emma Coronel, she's never Emma Coronel. She's always the wife of El Chapo. And so what I'm really trying to do is move away from that and understand Emma's motivations in their own right, rather than just think of her as the wife of. And in doing this and in working with the UN, I would highlight three things that have come up. So by moving away from the stereotypes, and this is a very conscious effort that UNODC is doing, one of the things that really comes to light is that it's very difficult to separate the categories of perpetrator and victim for women within organized crime. And I think this is something very important when we think about the participation of women in criminal groups, that these are not mutually exclusive categories, but rather you can be both at any given time when you're part of a criminal group. The other thing that I would highlight, and Jennifer was definitely touching on this point, and particularly when she was focusing on qualitative research, is that organized crime tends to be biased towards understanding violent activities, right? So a lot of the coverage has to do with homicides, violence on the street, what kind of violence that we're seeing all the time. But if we think about these groups that also require tasks that are not violent to exist, then I think the role of women starts to become much more clearer. And I would argue that, you know, several of my colleagues have really focused on the roles that women have that are not violent, but we have not paid attention because, again, the bias has been towards violence. So there's a lot of activities that are not violent in themselves, and I would include money laundering in this, where women have very important roles to participate. And the other thing that has become very apparent is that, of course, representation matters. I think it matters that female scholars or scholars who are identify as female participate in this work because we bring a different perspective to the table. But it also means that it starts opening up the conversation about the criminal justice system and what do they look like. So by thinking about how women, you know, participate in organized crime, it also shows you sort of the other side of the mirror and you think, okay, how do criminal justice systems around the world look? Do we have female judges? Are they targeted more, for instance, because of their gender and the work that they do? Do you have women who are part of special investigation units? The reality is that in the same way that we don't have great data about women participating in organized crime, we don't have great data either about women participating in the criminal justice system. How many do they work in these special investigation units? And the reality is that there's very few, in the cases where we have data, we find that it's very few women who actually also work in this. And then, of course, it has consequences when we think about the witness protection, victim protection programs that are so essential for understanding organized crime. And so we see not only from the point, you know, by, again, moving away from the stereotype, it's not only about how women are participating, but the entire sort of like chain in terms of, you know, once you encounter the criminal justice system, what happens there. And this matters because to the extent that we start thinking in these gender responsive ways, then we can truly then design systems that can effectively respond to organized crime. To the extent that we're stuck in the stereotype world where we're just calling Emma Coronel the wife of El Chapo, states are going to be incredibly inept and ineffective in responding to organized crime. And so this is not just a feel-good exercise, and this is not just, you know, for intellectual curiosity of those, you know, like myself who study this, but it rather has some
Cecilia, sorry, we lost your last sentence due to connection.
I was just saying that I'll stop with that last point. No,
it was super interesting. I was so much into it. Thanks a lot for the input. And as Cecilia will have to leave at 6:30, maybe I can also continue a bit with having a question. And I would also encourage the participants, if they have questions to Cecilia, please address them before 6:30. She has to catch a flight. But Cecilia, like the toolkit developed for UNODC on, I think it's super important. Like, how do you think that governments can make use of these toolkits, which address human rights or gender aspects into their criminal justice legislation or policies? So, can you please just give some hints on that? Thank you.
Can you hear me now? Okay, great. So there's a number of things that are important, and I would highlight UNODC has made a very important effort in not just preaching to the converted. And by that, I mean, Canada has a feminist foreign policy. Germany recently adopted a feminist foreign policy, which, great news. But it's not just, the toolkits are not designed just for member states who, already have placed importance on gender in their endeavors around the world. And so it's really designed to bring everyone along, which of course, makes things slower, but the idea is we'll bring everyone along with this. We're not just talking to those who consider this important. The other interesting point that I would highlight is that the toolkit was not developed, in the obscurity of a cubicle, by 3 people. This was very much developed in consultation with public officials, policymakers, those who are in the trenches of responding to organized crime in different contexts from around the world. So to really try to, cater to their needs. What is it that they encounter in their day-to-day, activities, and how can we design then technical assistance that caters to those needs? And importantly, the toolkit, it really has practical information. I mean, arguably, this is the least academic document I've ever written, and that's fantastic news. But it includes advocacy points. It has budgeting checklists. And so what's fantastic here is if you're a member state or if you're a civil society organization and you want that technical assistance, UNODC will come to you and provide that technical assistance. The idea is to help you implement these and really, just move away from that theory-heavy, area to really move into the how can we make this a reality in your context, understanding your needs. And so right now, I know some trainings have already happened in Southeast Asia, so that's great. I know there's going to be happening in other regions, but I know there's an interest in, taking these to whomever is interested in learning about it. And again, the toolkit is very practical. Of course, there's always room for improvement, and there's interest in having that feedback. But the idea is that this is a document that can be, used by policymakers that have to deal with organized crime. And again, with the idea that then you actually craft an effective response. It has been great working on it. I would also, I'll finalize my round of comments with these other points, but we even bring to the table why intersectionality matters when you think about these. So some of these concepts that can seem very abstract, we have really put a lot of effort into thinking, how do we make them relevant to those who are on the front lines of this? And so, it's free to download, soon available in other languages, but thanks for that question.
Thank you, Cecilia. And it really brings us to our next speaker, who comes from a governmental organization. And I would like Nara to come in. Nara, I hope.
Yes, I'm here.
You're there. Hi, Nara. Nara had some struggles with the internet, but everything is fine. So Nara, please just a short introduction of yourself, and also what does it mean invisible women from the governmental perspective?
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon from Brazil, and I think that for some of you it will be good evening. I first of all would like to say thank you for the organizers of this panel, and I'm very happy to be here and sharing this activity with the other panelists. I have been working in drug policies for more than 2 decades up to now. But most of this time, I have worked in the interaction between drug policies and health, especially vulnerabilities to TB, HIV, and other STIs. But recently, before joining the team at the Ministry of Justice, so I'm now the director of the Prevention and Social Integration Department of the National Secretariat of Drug Policies. and that is in the structure of the Ministry of Justice in Brazil. Just right before I had this recent experience with the judiciary in Brazil, the National Council of Justice, where I moved to this interaction more from health to criminal justice system, so drug policies and criminal justice system. And so I have some information here to share with you. And when we talk about invisible women here in the perspective of the government, we are talking about invisible rights. And maybe there's, I'm not sure if I can share some slides right now. But if so, I would like to share some information here. Is that right? Okay, may I share some slides here? Yeah, okay.
You can keep it right.
Just to illustrate what I'm talking about when I'm talking about invisible rights. So when we look at the prison system in Brazil, we see that most of the incarcerated, the numbers of the prison system, we see that most of the incarcerated people here, when around with men, we have almost 1/3 of men, they are incarcerated to the drug law offenses. But when we look at women, even though they are in a lower number, much lower than men, the drug law is the first reason for incarceration in the country. So if we look only at numbers, we do not see beyond, we have this, that might be this trend that, no, okay, this is not the priority. But if we look beyond and we look what these numbers represent, so who are these women incarcerated here? They are young. What is the impact of incarcerating these women at this period of their life? So what are they going to lose in terms of possibilities of education, professional possibilities? And there is also this racial issue that is really important here. We are talking about 60% they are Black. And even though the Brazilian law protects pregnant, breastfeeding, and women with children up to 12 years old, we are still incarcerating women that by the law they are protected from incarceration. And there is also a much more invisible side of this, that is the trans women. So they are in a very much lower number in prison units. But what does this mean to be for trans women to be incarcerated? What are we talking about and we have to think about violations of rights? And because if we look at only at number, it doesn't seem that this is a priority. But if we think on the conditions and what they are losing in terms of rights, it's very much important that from the perspective of the drug policy, we look at these women in the prison system. And even though, and when we talk about rights, even though in a period such as the period of COVID, where all international authorities were saying that, were affirming that we should not incarcerate people because of the pandemic. If we have, and if we could do so, we should not be putting, because they would be in a much more vulnerable context for COVID. The information on pregnancy, the information on children were not present in the arrest warrants here. And there were more than 150,000 arrest warrants evaluated in this assessment carried out by the National Council of Justice. And the information that could prevent these women from being incarcerated was not just there, was not there, was not even there. So this is invisibility. And if we talk about, because here there is this trend also to see the response to incarceration of women and of other people as well as an alternative could be the electronic home monitoring. And again, there is a very lower number of women in electronic home monitoring. But what does this, is this really a response? Is this really a way out of incarceration? It's okay, it's better than being in a prison unit, but what does this mean in terms of these women being confined at home and on using an electronic monitoring device? There was another assessment carried out by the National Council of Justice that carried out in 10 Brazilian states with relevant actors for the electronic monitoring in the country. So judges, public defenders, prosecutors, the multi-professional teams that are responsible for the supervision of the electronic monitoring measure, and also the people monitored were interviewed. 100% of them had the idea that mentioned that it is better for women with children. This is a better option for women with children. But 84, when we turn to monitored people to see their perspective on the electronic monitor, they mentioned that they face barriers for social interaction, stigma, prejudice, barriers to find a job, skin injuries, laceration, depression, and other mental health issues. So is this really an alternative? What is the impact in the life of these women, especially considering that Brazil is a country marked by gender inequalities? So most of these women will be responsible for the children in the family, might be also responsible for the elderly, and also for people with chronic disease. They might be the one responsible in the family. And also, as we know, these people come from a very social, vulnerable context of life in general. And there is another and more recent assessment in the profile of people prosecuted in Brazilian state and federal courts. So when we see that, we can see from this, what I think I would like to highlight here in terms of information from this assessment, is that when we look at the numbers, not only for women, but for all the prosecuted people, 1/3 them have been prosecuted before, so they are going out and coming back again. And for drug policies, this is also very relevant because more than 50% are being prosecuted for drug law offenses. And again, the number of women is much lower, but the impact in the lives of these women if they are going out and coming back. So what would be really a response that could break this cycle of vulnerability, because that's it. They lose their possibilities of having other options in their lives once they incarcerated, or using electronic devices as an alternative will also be a strong barrier for them for having a professional life, for taking care of their children, taking care of their family, or having their life as any other woman could have. So I will stop here because I think this is just to give some highlights and for our discussions. But when you asked me about invisible women in the perspective of the government, I think we're talking about invisible rights. They have rights by the law, but these rights are not being respected, are not being considered most of the times. And we are more and more, because there is a trend of increasing the rate of women being incarcerated, and this has a lot to do with the drug policy in the country. So I think that's it.
Thank you, Nara. You highlighted it, like the invisible women would mean invisible rights. And I think this is a keyword I'll take with me, and hope also some of the participants. Yeah, because I think it's very important that we point that out throughout all our work. I would like now to zoom in more and go to the community level from the perspective of GIZ project, or GIZ perspective, with my colleague Sarah. Sarah, what does it mean in your area of work, invisible women, in alternative development? So now we go a bit, we shift into the value chain of drug supply and we go to the drug supply part.
Yes, thank you very much, Adela, and thanks a lot to the organizers for the invitation to speak on this panel among such distinguished colleagues. Very pleased to be here, and has already been a very interesting session so far. My name is Sarah David. I'm an advisor working for GIZ in a sector project on rural development, which is commissioned by the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. And there, within that project, I'm responsible for alternative development in drug crop cultivation areas. And I'm also heading a subcomponent within the EU-financed COPOLAT project. COPOLAT stands for Cooperation Program between Latin America, the Caribbean, and the European Union on drug policies, where I'm heading the alternative development component, and where we work together with many countries from Latin America and the Caribbean. And I have been working on this issue for almost or more than 5 years now, and I would like to start by saying that when I joined the project and we advised the ministry at international level in many policy processes, and when I had a first look at all the documents and the normative framework that was there, I was quite a bit surprised, I have to say, because the issue of gender was not really present, and that doesn't mean that many people have not been working on it before, but I think it tends to be forgotten, the issue of gender, and then at some point it pops up again and gains attention. So I hope that this time it's for good and it stays around. But we have been doing some work on the issue, and especially with the question of how are women involved in the drug value chain, but from a perspective of producers, which to our understanding is the weakest link in the drug value chain, and is often a part of the value chain which is misunderstood, misinterpreted. Many of drug producers are seen to be criminals and to be equalized with other parts of organized criminal crime groups. And we've been doing some work in order to sort of deconceptualize that and visualize the people behind that are involved in drug crop cultivation, and since a couple of years, especially with the focus on women. And in order to do that, we actually had to, or we wanted to go into the field first, because there was not a lot of research. Like 5-6 years ago, I think it's safe to say you couldn't find a lot of information on women involved in drug crop cultivation, which means coca or opium poppy or cannabis. I think with regard to cannabis, it's still quite difficult, and with opium poppy more or less. With coca, there's been quite some research, which is great. But what we did was we organized some sort of secret meetings together with open society foundations in 2018, where we invited women from rural areas that were involved or also not in drug crop cultivation from Bolivia, from Peru, from Colombia, Ecuador, and Mexico, and brought them together in a sort of safe space in order to hear about their life realities, because really this is what was missing. And before we wanted to start with conceptualizing and advancing in how the adjustment of alternative development with regard to gender should look like, we wanted to hear from themselves and see what their lives realities were. And I think it's safe to say that women, especially living in rural areas where drug crops are being cultivated, I mean, they share characteristics with women living in other rural areas, which especially in other parts of the world have to face some harsh conditions as well. But women living in these areas with drug crop cultivation, they share an added stigma due to this illicit activity. They usually live in environments that are marked by multi-dimensional poverty, and they have to cope in some cases with the presence of armed groups and conflicts, and this results in a high level of personal insecurity. Furthermore, they encounter a lot of social and economic challenges due to traditional gender stereotypes that impede their equitable access to opportunities, resources, and services. But at the same time, and I think this is also true for women in rural areas in general, they are the backbone of their communities, and they actually play a key role in improving their rural living conditions, which is not a mean in itself. Of course, the aim is to foster and empower women, but it's sort of important to note that if you shift your focus in development measures on women, the overall impact will be greater. So what we did was we asked the women that were part of the workshop, what sort of activities do they carry out, where are they involved? And as it had been rightly said also at the beginning by Jennifer, in general, of course, they are involved in all parts of the illicit drug value chain, but also with a closer look at just part of the value chain, they're actually involved in all activities. Let's say to a certain degree in some parts, but in this specific case, they carry out agricultural work and at the same time have to carry the burden of care work and taking care of the household, which means looking after children, preparing food for family and farm workers and bring that food to the farm workers. They have to take care of cleaning, washing clothes, while also tending to livestock, and they are fully involved in the cultivation of food and coca, opium, or cannabis crops. And at the same time, we had invited women that were already very active and had some social or political function within their communities, but they had only gotten there with a hard price that they had to pay, because it's not very easy in some of these communities to be active at community or political level. Some of them were not allowed initially to do so by their husbands or by other community members, so they had already a path crossed a long way in order to be there, and was very important to hear that and to visualize that all of these tasks are not being remunerated, because if they're part of a family business, usually men receive all the income because they are the middlemen that in the end hand out the coca leaves or the pasta base or the raw opium to the traders. And so in the end, women tend to not receive any cash from it. So what does that mean if we think about alternative development measures, development-oriented drug policies from a development cooperation perspective? Of course, then you have to design measures in a certain way in order to ensure that women are visible, that you visualize them before planning or implementing a project, and that you have specific measures which will attend to their needs. And as Adela mentioned already in the beginning, and also Cecilia, the German federal government now has this new feminist development policy, which is great. And really there, the focus is on equal access to rights, resources, and representation, the sort of 3 Rs, which are at the center of this policy. And this means for us that when designing alternative development measures, we have to take into account the needs of women living in these areas, take them into account as individuals and not just member of a family or community, which has happened a lot in the past. You just have a look at family units and then you forget the individuals in them. And we have to see them as agents of change, and we have to create safe spaces for them to express their needs and opinions about the measures that are to be implemented. And only in this way, in the end, hopefully soon, but it's probably going to take us some time, we can actually accelerate the transformation of power relations at community level, but then also at national level, international level, and achieve gender equality. No? But that's our vision. That's where we aim to go. And as I already mentioned, I think at a normative level, there has been really a shift, and we have seen in the past years resolutions at the CND mentioning the need to foster gender approaches within alternative development. So I think more and more countries are getting on board. Of course, there are many that will be resisting but at least there has been some advancement. But for us, it's very important to then think about how do we actually do it, because it's great to have it on paper. But how can we support countries in actually establishing strategies and concrete action plans where you take women into account and where you figure out measures that will actually attend their needs. And maybe I would just quickly say one example, and maybe afterwards I can go more in detail if we have more time. But so one typical alternative development measure is, of course, sort of thinking of an alternative economy instead of the illicit economy. So in most cases, this would be some agricultural value chain. I think the most common examples are cocoa and coffee value chains, but of course there are many other things you can do. But with a view to value chains, of course, it's very important to see where is the most value being generated, which is usually at the end of the value chain and at the beginning. But in order to help women accelerate in their development and in order for them to gain more money, we have to have a look at these value chains and see where they should be integrated and where we need to support them in order to actually gain more money. Because also in value chains, women tend to be invisible, and this has many reasons. One of them is, for example, if it's a family-owned business, these businesses tend to be assumed to be led by men, and therefore there's little consideration of women. If there are female-led cooperatives, they are usually sort of seen as domestic and small scale and might not receive a lot of investment, and for that reason tend to have a low technical input. And this then turns into the observation that these businesses might not be competitive and might probably not advance, and therefore they are not being considered in value chain analysis. And in some cases, women are also, I mean, they're part of a family business or business owners. This is great, but in many cases, they are simply workers or day laborers involved in value chains. And then when we do a mapping exercise, which is something which would be the next step and the necessary step, they're simply forgotten. So I kind of want to leave it here at this moment, but happy to go a bit deeper into the details, because within Copolat we developed some tools for that, which I will put in the chat. We have a web-based training on gender and alternative development, and also a practical guide with similar to the guide that Cecilia presented, has a lot of checklists on what you can actually do to involve women in value chains and to make them visible. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, very much. Indeed, I think we drove from research to now to the communities, and we saw, and also reading all of the researches, some of the researches from the speakers here, you could see that the same applies to licit and illicit economies. So women are there where labor-intensive force is needed, so they are in the harvesting. But when money transaction happens, they tend to be less present or less researched. And I would quote something from Cecilia, which really I liked a lot, and maybe we can take it over. Women are both predators and victims. And sometimes by stereotyping them, we leave them aside in our research or works. Cecilia, do you want to add anything before you leave, or that's like a closing remark to the audience, what they can take with them?
I would add two things, and hopefully one is definitely not intended to sound like I'm the defender of men's rights and that hideous movement. But one, I would say that certainly by ignoring gender, we're also then ignoring how men are victimized within organized crime, right? Like the focus on this masculinity then also means that we're not also providing the services that men who are also, participate and victims within organized crime, we're not paying attention to them. So we're also underserving them. So this is why, these gender responsive, frameworks matter, because then that means that we are actually, catering to everyone who should get those services. And I would, on this hill, I will die. I say this everywhere I go, but from academia, from civil society, we can help you, but you need to share data. And this is a message to member states and international organizations. We're not asking for state secrets. There's very creative ways in which data can be shared, but to the extent that we don't create those partnerships and we don't think about how we can collaborate in those ways, I think we're going to continue to have these deficits that my fellow panelists mentioned today. So thank you again to the Drugs and Development Hub for inviting me. It has been a pleasure. I'm sorry I have to leave early, but the plane will not wait for me. So thank you for your time and good luck with the final round of comments.
Thank you very much, Cecilia. It was really great to have you. Thanks a lot. And I want to emphasize that, yes, when we talk about gender-sensitive drug policies, we are not talking about women only. We are talking about inclusive policies. And I would like to go around. I don't see any Q&As in the chat, but I would like to give again the floor to our distinguished panelists. Jennifer, we started we took off at how academia can help more qualitative research. And you have such a long experience in studying the topics of organized crime and also gender focused. Can you maybe give a last recommendation of how can we all in this panel cooperate so that we increase the research, which has a gender lens also part of it?
Oh, it's a difficult one. I mean, I think for policy to work, it has to be. It's always based on an assumption about what's happening, right? And I think unless we have researchers looking at what's actually happening, you're going to have bad policy. So if you think women aren't important in the cocaine trade and you do alternative development and you don't include women, it's not going to work, right? So I think researchers have spent a very long time demonstrating that women are present in the drug trade, but I think that women are not uniformly present. And they don't do the same things, and those drug trades are country specific, actually. And I think I would like to see more comparative work, which is what kind of policy interventions have good outcomes for women. And by this, I don't mean, a drug-free world. I mean, which are the kinds of policies that reduce violence against women involved in drug markets? And these can be, if we pay attention, there are surprising things happening. There's a great piece of research done in the USA, in the southern states, where there was a change in legislation around precursor chemicals for manufacturing methamphetamine. So rather than methamphetamine being made in larger facilities, which were run by men, which were very much more gender stratified, there was a period of time, now ended, where the dominant mode of manufacturing methamphetamine was in a plastic bottle. It's called the shake and bake method. You combine a cocktail of horrendous chemicals, you kind of shake it and burp it, and it was producing kind of low quality meth, but it wasn't so commercially viable. And as a result, for a time, violence against women connected to the drug trade disappeared. There were more all-women groups, women were manufacturing their own meth, and violence against women decreased. But then what happens is someone comes in and says, oh, but this hasn't stamped out the drug trade, and then the law changes again, and then manufacturing changes again. And I think that example keeps coming back to me. It's like where we need to pay attention to how gender matters in the drug trade. Like, yes, it matters, but how? So how could interventions tip that balance or dial things down? And I think about this often when we think about the violence of criminalization of women. How do we criminalize drugs? Or if we're going to criminalize drugs, how do we do that in a way that dials down picking up sort of people who are more peripherally involved? And in the UK, there's been some very pragmatic moves to arrest fewer people who are carrying drugs at airports, to put it politely. So if we look at the number of people arrested for drug trafficking in the UK, it's at one point it was about 1,500 a year, and now it's about 300 a year. So it's fallen off a lot. And that's not because there's less drugs on the street. It's because of really pragmatic decisions being made by government. And that decision was totally black boxed. So I know about it because I spoke to someone who was retired who had an off the record conversation with me. But there is no researcher input in there. There was no evaluation of what was happening. I think it's a good policy intervention, but it's not one that I can write about because we don't have any data about how those decisions were made and what's happening at the ground. So I think there may be good things happening, but we're missing them because we're not collecting data, we're not monitoring when we could be. But that's what I would say. Over to the next person.
Thank you, Jennifer. You brought up the topic of, we keep breaking up the topic of data, which I think is super important. And this is why we call this session Invisible Women, because without data, it is invisible. Like we are talking about something invisible. And this is why it's a big call to also collect data. And maybe I go to Nara, who has somehow a bit of power to maybe start collecting the data in being part of a government. And Nara, can you please just jump in and say, like, where can we collect this data? Maybe, like, how to make it happen?
Well, I think we have different sources here. As I mentioned, we recently launched that one on the profile of people prosecuted in state and federal courts. To start with, it was launched 1 month ago, so it's this secretariat. As you know, this is a new government in the first year of the government, and we have established here something that was not here before in the structure of the secretariat. That is a department on research and studies, and because this is very much important, we need to build something in considering data and information. But also, I did not mention what we are doing. I was just mentioning what some information we already have. But the other source is records. We have systems of information that, but unfortunately, in a country with the size of Brazil, not every state and municipality they feel data as they should be. So work on that, on qualifying the information that we have, because we have systems in the health field, we have systems in the criminal justice field and prisons information, and how do we work with qualify this the way people put information in this systems, and how do we qualify the interpretation of this data, the analysis of this data that is there, it's ready to be available, but we need people to seriously considering their role of providing the information, and and we do not have a feedback from everybody in the same way, every state in the same way. For example, the system of information on the prison population, we do not have information from São Paulo that has the most the biggest prison system, state prison system in the country. So this is one thing. Another one is that what we are doing is that we have in the information that is produced, that is developed by other policies, because as a national secretariat on drug policies, we are here to coordinate many different policies that are ongoing and that should consider drugs and for our theme here in this panel, gender issues, and how do they consider that in what they are doing, in the information they are producing. So we have established this the working group is exactly to discuss what other policies could do to give visibility to this issue, to give visibility to these women's rights that they are not being respected, they are not being considered. And we have the ministries of women, health, human rights, racial equality, indigenous population, social development, labor and employment, because they are doing a lot. But what we see is that this drugs, criminal justice, and they are not visible in what they are doing. And this should not be something to be taken care but only by the Ministry of Justice alone. We need to coordinate this policy. And besides that, also consider the very much relevant information civil society has also produced with the work they have been doing, because we have civil society organizations here that have been working for a long time, and they have very much relevant information that they can provide. So we have joined them and invited them to this working group. And besides that, also we have another system that is the system of information from the judiciary, from the courts, from the both federal and state courts, which is also not very, still needs qualification. And the National Council of Justice has been working that a lot. Because when we need information on women, for example, in detention control hearings, that is the entry point. It's where the pretrial detention will be decided, and a very important decision to the life of these people in general, but these women is decided. What are the information on these women and what is on the decisions taken? And we need more information on that as well. So I think that investing that, and we have been talking to them on how can we collaborate in the field of drug policies in this way. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Nara. Indeed, it's very, I see like a vicious circle, like governments have to collect data to input research, and research has to then elaborate those data and bring recommendation to the research, to the government. So yeah, there is a very strong linkage between the two. But Sarah, I'll come back to you, especially because we both work on projects with beneficiaries and women supporting the value chain. And I still want to maybe, for the audience, elaborate a bit, how can we empower women who already are doing some activities which unfortunately do not give them enough income to get out of the illicit economy. So how can we, by identifying their roles into the whole production circle, like value chain analysis, make them empowered enough so that they don't need to get involved into illicit economy? They can earn enough money for their families to live without being involved in the illicit economy. And I know that you have done also good work on with governments also.
No, thank you, Adela. Very important question. I think I would like to start by mentioning something again from this first exercise which we did, because something which was very important to the women who participated was that they kept saying that although being involved in coca cultivation has brought them many troubles, some of them were head of households, and it was actually a way of them of earning an income. And it has given them opportunities to break free from violent relationships, to support their children, and to sort of also buy just some things for themselves, which they were not able to do so before. So this is something which we think is super important to have in mind when designing measures, because it gives an income, so but it brings also some issues. So in the end, what alternative development is trying to do is to offer alternative livelihood options, diversify income, and create a better development environment for women and their families, or families in general. And so in order to do that, so the one thing which I mentioned is to see the value chains which will be put in place can also be, of course, ecotourism or maybe some handicraft. So I think there are many opportunities, and it's very important to actually have that bottom-up approach and get in touch with the communities and the specific women to see what their ideas are. Maybe they are already working on something, and then work on that. But to find activities that actually generate value and that will give them an income which is higher than what they earned with coca or cannabis cultivation. because this is also a myth that they earn a lot of money with it. They call it like the cara chica, so it gives them some money, but of course it's not a lot. So of course there are other activities which could bring them better living conditions, and that's what we are trying to focus on. But I think apart from value chains, what's really important are a couple of things. Capacity building for women in these specific areas. I think we need to foster access to financial services. This is also something which was brought up that in many cases, due to the fact that women do not own land in many cases and countries where it's difficult to inherit land or even obtain land titles, they were also not able to obtain access to financial services, and they were essentially bound to the coca economy in order to get some loans from the shop next door. Yeah, so this is, I think, land rights and financial services have to be accompanying measures in order to foster women's access to better income, access to technology, of course, and the issue of supporting cooperatives or cooperative styles and organizations in order to let their businesses grow. But then there are other factors in the environment, like in the environment around the business, and of course at local level, at state level, national level, which have to be taken into account, and where their rights and voices have to be raised. So it's I don't know, it's a very broad answer, but just to say that we really need an integrated approach, and it's not just focusing on one value chain, on one product, but we actually need to change the framework conditions in order to empower women and in the end change their living conditions.
Thank you, Sarah. Thanks a lot also for this, just being in time. We are almost at the end, and I would really like to maybe sum up what we discussed. I think I'll take away with me some keywords. Data was mentioned by all of us as a very important starting point. And once we have the data, we need to investigate and understand and make a clear picture. Where do women stand? Are they victims or are they the predators? So what is their role? It can be both, it can be one or the other, and then we can make policies which really fit the situation. But if we keep ignoring that there is a gender aspect into drug policies, then we might come into the vicious circle, which the researchers, and Jennifer mentioned it very clearly, have shown us till now. So I would really like to thank all the panelists for your very valuable contributions and all the great work you have been doing. I personally was very much inspired, and I loved reading through your policies, documents, research papers. I highly recommend also the others in the audience or those who listen to the record to go Google your names and find your contributions. And I really hope this is not the last discussion. I know that during this 24 hours, there were several sessions on gender and organized crime. So I hope that we materialize with data. So once we meet next year or in the future, we see more research, more funds for research on the topic, and more data available both by national governments, NGOs, civil society organizations, and others. Thank you very much. And there are some links in the chat for those who are interested for the documents that have been mentioned. And you can always find all of us, I think, in LinkedIn, or there is a profile of us in the webpage of the conference. Thank you very much, and I wish you a good evening for those in Europe.